The Jetsons 1963, Issue 6. Surprisingly, Elroy shoots water at his father's trophy as Judy glares at another one, and for some reason, he doesn't immediately explain himself to Jane. Judy, the non-genius, has to explain for him that George is so busy winning trophies that he has no time for the kids. At least he's finally doing things he actually likes for himself now instead of just catering to their whims. This is good for him. It's amusing that Jane squirts the trophy too. It's weird of Elroy to say, "Atta boy," when she's a girl, and that he isn't corrected. Jane wants to go find George to nag him. Judy says that at supper he takes his dinner in a food pill to not waste any time. So at least it's canon that that's why people bother with them. Still, multivitamins exist and they didn't replace meals for anyone. Somehow, both kids say the same thing, and Jane stays optimistic and decides to ruin George's literal armchair with a copy of the armchair repair manual. Because repairing is the same thing as changing how it works. George drives home with me still not knowing what his trophies are for, and he lampshades the weirdness of how his family greets him. They must have rehearsed this. Even then, it's weird of Jane to call him father. Of course, the armchair grabs him, and he's told off for never being home. Now, he can't catch a break. Why can't he have a middle ground? He smartly humors them, calling himself self-centered, and promising to turn over a new leaf and eat a real dinner with his family. He also chokes because he got used to eating food pills, somehow, as I'm thankful that implies people don't usually eat them. Then we see even more thief villains that want to bother the Jetsons. That family is lucky it can stay optimistic when it gets bothered by criminals every other day. Some thieves want to get into the athletic association when the guard doesn't let anyone but members of the men's club inside. So they decide to stow away in the trunk of George's car to get in the club. I guess him having a purple space mobile represents Jane being the one really in charge of his life, because he even picked a car based on what color she'd want. Or somehow purple isn't just considered a girly color later. George plans to take his family to the park. The men's club wonders where he is and gets worried because he isn't answering his visual phone and is late. So one of them assumes he had a power failure and can't get out of their exit tube. Except Judy could climb up and down it with a rope, so that's dumb of him to assume. So George's association with the men's club might work out. Someone from it goes to his house effortlessly without a key, somehow. I guess he was listed by George as one of the people allowed to visit his apartment. He thinks his house was ransacked and calls the police, warning them that the Jetsons are in distress. George gets threatened by the thieves leaving his trunk with guns, and the police space mobile comes after them, as George's car was reported to them from headquarters, I guess just because it was missing. So, the guy from the club assumed based on stuff like the house being messy that the family was kidnapped by someone who stole their car. The criminals take the super slide after Elroy to try to escape, probably because it'd be faster than running away. George is smart enough to assume they won't be able to handle the slide because it's so bumpy. There's no reason there'd be a loop in the slide, because no matter how fast the mere slide would make them go, they'd still fall off the top of it. So it won't be designed like that. They didn't even need to be made motion sick from it this way, because anyone could do what George did and punch them at the end of the slide. The story ends with the family calling George's reward money a trophy and thankfully appreciating it, when it's only a trophy metaphorically. It's smart of Elroy to ask him to buy him something with that money. In the next story, Elroy's somehow stupid enough to throw Astro's ball across the road that some space mobiles are just barely hovering over. If there are roads, why on earth would the space mobiles fly that close to it when they aren't required to by law, and not doing so would keep the pedestrians safe? Well, maybe everyone knows they use less gas if they fly a lot closer to the ground, because their anti-gravity device doesn't have to work as hard. Still, Elroy should have known inter-asteroid roads were a bad place to play. He says he'll go to the park, but the robot nannies pushing baby strollers tell him not to play at a public park or they'll wake up the babies. Aoi agrees like a doormat instead of getting the cops, who would surely remind these robots that the park is for everyone. He finds out even the robo ball field is crowded, as we see some kids in front of buttons that can control robotic pitchers and catchers and baseball players on the bases. And I guess the logic is they'd accept this over baseball because it's less hard work. Aoi goes home and gets scared by a moving vacuum and window washing robot. So much for Jane washing windows herself like before. I guess she bought it recently. Jane tells them she told them not to play in the house on cleaning day because it's dangerous. He must have forgot it was cleaning day. Aoi and Astro go out in the backyard and get upset that they can't even play out there with the auto mower going. So now they don't need a gardener robot to mow the lawn for them. Well, we did see George trash his. I guess he just bought it so that his gardening would get done faster, because his gardener robot wouldn't have to do this anymore. Aoi complains as if this is somehow the first time he ever encountered this problem, and he hasn't already come up with a solution from experience. George decides to send him to his cousin Jethro's farm for the weekend, and Aoi calling it a real farm makes me worried that the twist will be that it won't be a normal farm. But it's not fair to say it's not a real farm, because we're just going to be wishing our farms were improved that much. The old farms deserve that moniker of not real farm for being outdated, and Aoi wouldn't think it's not a real farm, unless it's really rare for farms to have great technology. He's excited because he read about normal farms, gets told he'll get shown a barn, and is bored by the machines because it looks just like a power plant back home. How did he even have books on real farms if this guy talks as if this is how all farms are? The whole farms run automatically. It reminds me of my theory that Starline made stuff like this in a greenhouse in the bases he lived in. Producing his own food would save him the trouble of going out grocery shopping. We'd say some automatic feeders. They move around and use robot hands to throw feed at the animals. Aoi says it's no fun, and I wish he was realistically told that it could be dangerous to go try to feed the animals manually because chickens could peck at you. And even a cow could try to kill you for being near their calves. He somehow doesn't care enough to prove he's in the right though, and instead Aoi is told to go play and hates that he's in the way of the machines. There's an automatic machine for tilling and planting seeds, just like in real life, but smaller. In fact, there's a reason it shouldn't be this small, because how could it fit all of the seeds it needs in it? There's a robot for herding sheep, and another for harvesting crops. So I have to assume the only thing a farmer does anymore is supervise and maintain the machines. Aoi goes to the only place he's found where Astro can fetch without being trampled. He throws a ball in a place with machines like an idiot, and a mere ball shuts down the farm. Luckily, the farmer doesn't plan on punishing him or even scolding him like you'd expect. He says there's no real harm done for some reason, and plans to call a power service. Aoi apologizes for fouling up the gears and says he'll help get the farm work done with Astro. The farmer says he hasn't milked a cow since he was a boy, and forgot how satisfying doing your own work is. And we see Astro herding the sheep happily. Fortunately, the farmer finally gets to explain his side of the argument. The farm can't show a profit this way, because in this age you have to have super production for that. This would be more believable if it was established that he had so many crops and animals that he needs machines to take care of all of them. But neither of them seem to notice. Aoi gets an idea, saying that a lot of other people would enjoy farm work because they're tired of just pushing buttons. He'd be more convincing if he said they'd want exercise. Somehow people agree to pay the farmer to do work on the farm. Well, I get the comic's logic here. At least the Sabrina 2000s comic was honest about how farm work is back-breaking menial labor, involving cleaning up after the animals. How would someone think hoeing is fun when it involves bending over and swinging it a lot? She must have just started doing it. Some of these people would want their money back and get mad at being told no. Sadly, there's another reason this couldn't happen. He's trusting these people with his animals when he doesn't know for a fact that every one of them will be gentle with them. And he trusts them with his crops when they could steal them. So this could backfire. I'm sure that's the reason a farmer would need a job interview to get hired. At least I assume, because I think everything forces a job interview. Besides, again, animals can attack. Do you think people would get mad at him for being pet or charged into by cows? He says the best part is that Elroy has a place to play. But the story ends with him and Astro not even getting that because the farm's crowded. In the next story, George thanks Rosie while watching Future Elvis and tells her to take the rest of the night off. Jane suggests going out when she was never told where she could go out for fun. So of course she says she'll just go to bed in her room. I guess she sleeps in the guest room that was already there because it'd be costly to make a new bedroom for the maid bought. Jane's worried about her for never going out with anyone, and George doesn't care because she's not human. It could easily be written that he doesn't care because she's the maid. That'd be bad, but a little better. Jane thinks she should meet a nice robot boyfriend. George suddenly decides to humor her and gets the house a butler bought. They're officially rich. This is just like Veronica's mansion. He must have gotten the money from Elroy's inventions. I know robots don't have to get paid, I assume, unless they do, in which case it's even worse because I assume George had to buy this butler because he had to buy Rosie. And they have to pay for the maintenance of these robots as well, which is like paying for an employee's healthcare. So that's only a deal breaker if the robots need maintenance a lot more than the average employee needs medical care. Somehow, the robots shock each other from a handshake for no logical reason when they wouldn't be incompatible. Then the butler bot assumes the house needs his help for no reason, and that offends Rosie because he thinks he can run it better than her. She didn't run the house, Jane did. So it's nice of Jane and George to not reveal how offended that got them. Elroy hates being served food pills when he was smiling about it at the park. No way a butler would give him that. There's no pride in that for a chef. And how is Astro sad at seeing a bone? Rosie gets rid of the bad stuff on the table to give the family burgers, which have no reason to be called something else. Bolts the butler doesn't get the hint and still wants to treat the family like a snobby rich one, because classism makes total sense to program into your robots. Somehow, George reveals none of the family has the heart to tell Bolts they don't want to be uplifted. It's cool that Judy knows he doesn't stand a chance against Rosie. The family hates how Bolts is playing the violin while Rosie's playing rock music. Then George looks unhappy at Bolts trying to give him a day off suit, which Rosie lampshades as being silly. Somehow Jane has the arrogance to think cooking for herself the normal way would work out when she's so dependent on machines. So of course she sees Rosie ruining the food Bolts is preparing, pouring ketchup and French sauce. George calls a meeting with just his family, and Jane says he has to tell Bolts to leave. But Bolts is already moving out because of Rosie tying his antenna in knots and getting his signals crossed all morning. I guess robots can't sue. Why would it even matter? Won't he get his signals from the brain in his head? Don't tell me they get their signals from being remote controlled and they pick it up with an antenna. That wouldn't really make any sense. They seem to have minds of their own. Why would signals matter to Butler? It seems like an underwhelming cop-out that George doesn't have to deal with firing him after a whole story of build-up, just because somehow tying antenna up gives him brain damage. At least this does sort of make sense. I've seen worse writing before, but still, it feels way too easy. Especially since he gives George a refund on buying him. I doubt that happened. He would have given the money to the robot company, so they'd have already spent it, and this would mean they were putting new money of the same value in every robot they sell, just in case someone wants a refund on them. That would be a tremendous financial loss, where they're paying for the refund before it's even asked for with every sale. So it wouldn't happen. This would only make sense if Bolts explained that he got this money on his own. But I doubt his services would be appreciated by any family in the neighborhood. So who would ever give him this money? Bolts leaves, and while Jane calls Rosie mean, Judy hugs Rosie saying they love her just the same. It makes the family so charming that they all got genuinely attached to their maid as a member of the family because they're that nice. Because I think in terms of real life, it'd be just another job to most maids. The maid would be just another employee. And they wouldn't usually get this lucky. George asks Rosie why she doesn't ever go out, and explains that he bought bolts because he thought she was lonely. I hate when plots could have easily been avoided if the main characters had been smarter. Why didn't anyone say this to her before? Well, at least it's not forced, because I can assume everyone was too awkward to say this to her, because a lot of people would be too proud to admit if they were lonely. George even says, before asking her this, so it was an awkward question. Rosie says a good-looking robot like her has lots of friends. I thought she was considered ugly because she's considered old-fashioned and almost got abandoned in one episode for being obsolete. How can I take her word for it that she's got a lot of robot friends when I never see her having a social life, and she cunts when she's always in the house working, and is too tired to go out after work, which she explains. It'll feel better if in later issues we see her talking to other robots on the video phone in the house, explaining that she really does have friends, and explaining why she's able to have friends. She says she didn't say so to avoid the plot because she doesn't like to complain, even though being sassy is one of her character traits on TV tropes. At least, she's based on a sassy maid. The story ends with George being insanely stupid by getting a maid for the maid, even though a big deal was made about how expensive Rosie was in the first episode with her. He is rich. In the next story, Mr. Spacely says he'll send George to the Dude Ranch, and for some reason George is happy about this, so I can't wait to learn why. He thinks he's allowed to kiss his robot secretary. He thanks him, but he's not allowed to leave because of a big robot hand. Spacely says this wasn't a vacation, and he was sending him to the ranch to work. He should have known that. A guy like Spacely would have told him why he was going to send him on vacation before doing so. Spacely says we make the sprockets that go inside the robot horses, and they aren't working right. I know he's the factory owner, but it's so arrogant to say we when he doesn't do anything to make them. The robot horses are going off their sprockets and throwing people and running away. George says he'll fly there with an air ferry. I guess because he doesn't know where it is. He decides to ride one of the robot horses to see what he can find out. There's no way the robot horses would look like that, instead of resembling horses to make people accept them. He wonders how anything on wheels could buck. The robot horse's antenna crackle. Why does it have those? Are the antenna a general tracking device? The robot horse bounces when going over the rocky ground, and that throws him off. And George expects me to believe this ranch is off limits to aircraft for no reason. I guess the air ferry landed just outside the ranch. He wants a vehicle to get over the rough ground and calls someone to rent something. He calls what looks like a real horse an old model, making me wonder if it's a robot too for a second. Why is there a thud sound effect instead of showing us when he got thrown off the horse? Wouldn't that be better to see? He thanks the guy for the advice to hold on to the horse, which he should have already known to do. George rides the horse, and someone's riding a robot while having a pillow strapped to him. He gets thrown off, so he was useless, and George finds out an electronic guidance system is luring the robot horses into a space boxcar. So now I really wish I knew why there's antenna on them, because it did nothing but cause this. He goes into the rocket ship, which is automatic, and somehow it took until it got to a building to realize that there's a robot horse thief. George's horse scares the thief, who somehow calls the horse a monster, and George ends up thrown by the horse onto the bad guy. I always appreciate it when the story is resolved with a Chekhov's gun. You wouldn't expect this to help him, because it inconvenienced him earlier, but it makes sense that it did. It's always more believable to have the plot resolved by something that already came up. I guess I got so used to stories that were badly written that I'm expecting Deus Ex Machinas more than Chekhov's guns. For some reason, we don't see the bad guy get arrested and just get told about it. Spacely's happy that George revived an interest in horses and says he could take the family to a brand new dude ranch that has real horses. But George has the good sense to not trust real horses because they throw him off too, with apparently no excuse. So he says he'll take his reward in the form of a vacation on a robot horse ranch. And thankfully he was actually given this reward. The first story was about the family calling out George for spending all of his time away from home having fun at the men's club winning sports trophies, when he was portrayed as needing exercise earlier, and convincing him to spend time with them again. It makes sense that he'd start doing this, because since earlier on he was overworking just to cater to their every whim, it was inevitable that he'd take a vacation from it entirely instead of feeling like only doing half the work, because he'd feel like he earned a break. Rather than simply explaining this to them, I guess he assumes that'd be pointless, because he agrees to take them on a picnic instead. And for some reason, he worries the men's club by not telling them he won't be coming in. So one of them goes to his house, because it's so easy for just anybody to go into his house, and gets so worried at his unusual behavior that he calls the cops, assuming that his car got stolen with him in it. And I'm jumping to conclusions worked out getting some thieves arrested. So it's too bad no one in the family admits that him having fun at the men's club was worth it, and allows him to keep going in moderation. Sadly, it doesn't seem like the story actually required sci-fi technology to have the basic plot happen. Though it really speaks how good the Jetsons is, that even plots with that problem usually still feel like they're worth it. Elroy's story was about Elroy not being able to find a place with room to play because there's automatic machines everywhere. And I have to wonder why he ignored his front yard, instead of telling his dad he has no place to play with Astro and getting sent to an automatic farm. There's a message against a farm with such convenient, money-making, revolutionary technology, which is required for the farm to make enough money compared to the other farms. It ignores what a good thing it is because the farmer would enjoy doing the work himself more, even though it doesn't matter how one farmer feels when the point of farming is food production for everyone else. So clearly it's better for the greater good to get more food made, and a lot of farming would be exhausting labor and most farmers would like to be automated. I know tilling and planting is automated. Besides, he was trained in checking on and maintaining the machines, so he's lucky he even knows how to farm anyways. What about the random city people Elroy invited to work for him? They could hurt the animals, or get hurt, or steal his crops. So why was this treated like a permanent good change for the farm that every farmer should do? This was after he caused a power outage because he had nowhere to play and wasn't supervised by a guy who wasn't doing anything, and was stupid enough to play ball in a place full of machines. Considering that these random nobodies being trusted on a ranch is begging to backfire and get them and the farmer mad, I suppose Elroy deserves the fact that he still has nowhere to play by the end because he didn't improve the farm. Rosie's story was about Jane thinking Rosie is lonely for not going out for fun after work, which would only make sense if Rosie actually got a paycheck. And George buying a butler robot with no one making a big deal out of the expense. So I have to assume he sold an invention of Elroy's for the money. But it hates Rosie. For no reason, Bolt was programmed to treat the family like a snobby rich one, to force them to be one. After the two robots make the family miserable with their feud, George doesn't even have to fire Bolt because he quits. So instead of learning to stand up to him, he did nothing to undo his mistake, not that he wasn't punished, because the conflict of the episode was punishment enough. And the whole plot could have been avoided if someone had asked Rosie why she doesn't go out after work. But it's not forced because George said before asking, which made it clear that everyone thought it'd be awkward to ask her this. And even the person with the most common sense ever would still think it was awkward to ask her a question like this. I have to assume the story takes place shortly after they adopted Rosie into their family, because they would have already found out what Rosie told them here. The final story is about basically sending George to a robot horse dude ranch because it kept running off. And George is brave enough to ride one of the horses, despite being told they throw people off them. That lack of common sense caused them to find out that someone's using their antenna to lure them into a rocket ship to be stolen. I wish I knew why they have antenna in a world with no internet. Because that's why the plot even happened. George somehow knows how to rent a real horse, which I hope makes sense. And he ends up thrown from it onto the thief in a Chekhov's gun to stop him. And basically gives him a vacation, which is a nice surprise because I thought he was kidding himself when he thought he'd get one. It's very convenient though, because no matter how helpful he was, he only helped because he was forced to since it's his job. So he's lucky he felt generous instead of thinking that his regular paycheck was enough, because he was fine with getting him to do something outside his job description.